Post-traumatic stress disorder has been around since the beginning of war. We have accounts dating all the way back to 440 BC at the Battle of Marathon, where a Greek soldier named Espiliades became blind at the sight of his comrade being killed during battle. This wound was not a physical one and persisted over many years. In the 1600s, Swiss doctors came up with the term nostalgia to describe Swiss soldiers who became homesick and suffered despair. But more interesting was how it was used to also describe classical PTSD symptoms such as sleeplessness and anxiety. Nostalgia was a phenomenon noted throughout Europe as a quote-unquote disease and reached American soil during the United States Civil War. In fact, nostalgia became a common medical diagnosis that spread throughout camps, but some military doctors viewed the illness as a sign of weakness and only affected men with feeble will. And public ridicule was sometimes the recommended quote-unquote cure for nostalgia. While nostalgia described changes in veterans from a physiological perspective, other models took a psychological approach. After the Civil War, U.S. Dr. Jacob Mendez da Costa studied veterans and found that many of them suffered from certain physical issues unrelated to wounds such as palpitations, constricted breathing, and other cardiovascular symptoms. These symptoms were thought to arise from overstimulation of the heart's nervous system, and the condition became known as soldier's heart, irritable heart, or da Costa syndrome. So, have you ever seen this picture? It's a photograph of a British soldier who is suffering from PTSD, or as they called it during World War I, shell shock. Over 80,000 soldiers were diagnosed with shell shock in the British Army alone. Many of the extreme symptoms included paralysis or losing the ability to speak. Many people accepted that it was due to the constant shelling soldiers faced, hence the name. But according to the First World War A through Z, servicemen who had never been under shell fire also began experiencing the symptoms. So, they decided that shell shock was an, quote, emotional disturbance produced through the wider conditions of war. But the ways in which treating weren't better. They wanted to find a quote-unquote quick cure, and resorted to electrical shock therapy, or as the website www.spartacuseducational.com states, electric shock treatment was very popular. This involved an electrical current being applied to various body parts to cure the symptoms of shell shock. Patients who had a fear of noise were given rooms looking out onto a main road. Men who had been teachers or writers before the war were refused access to the library, and men who feared being alone were put into isolation. So, having a painful electric shock run through me, or purposely being thrown away in an isolated room, doesn't sound like I would be getting the correct treatment. But even the most common of cases were subject to only a few days of rest, then off to the front again, to be met with more combat. But can I take a second to describe to you how brutal combat was during World War I? Trench warfare consisted of endless barrages, suicidal charges across no man's land into exposed machine guns, gas attacks that some soldiers would describe men clawing their own throats out. Also, due to heavy rainfall, trench foot was common, and soldiers' feet would literally rot away in the mud. And, even more tragic was the fact that these men were considered cowards for not willing to fight. And this is what happened to those so-called cowards. During World War II, shell shock became battle fatigue. World War II differed from previous wars in its use of bigger field weapons and bombs, which placed soldiers at a greater risk. This is the case with the German Stuka dive bomber, with its signature howling siren sent troops into a state of panic. Don't believe me? See for yourself. Additionally, soldiers were placed into smaller combat groups, which reduced the social interaction, which may have been a protective factor for psychological afflictions. Indeed, the war took a tremendous psychological toll on soldiers. Despite the extensive use of psychiatric screening for selection, medical personnel were puzzled that although over 1 million soldiers were screened out of psychological reasons, there continued to be staggering numbers of psychiatric casualties in war. In fact, even soldiers who had fought bravely on previous tours were being affected. Over 25% of casualties were caused by war trauma, and at this rate was even higher, 50% for soldiers engaged in long, intense fighting. In fact, so many soldiers were affected that psychiatrists were confronted with the reality that psychological weakness had little to do with the subsequent distress in combat. Thus, terminology changed from combat neurosis to combat exhaustion or combat fatigue, reflecting the consensus that all soldiers were vulnerable to combat fatigue due to their environments. The U.S. Army adopted the official slang, "every man has his breaking point," in 1947. The U.S. Army released a documentary entitled Shades of Grey in treatment of mental illness during World War II. This documentary indicates the consensus at the time that no one is immune to mental illness, and that the environmental factors play a large role in the developmental of psychological problems. Combat exhaustion was thought to have encompassed such symptoms as hypovigilance, paranoia, depression, loss of memory, and conversion. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, added gross stress reaction to its Diagnostic of Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-I-1. The diagnosis related to psychological issues stemming from traumatic events, including combat and disasters, though it assumed that mental health issues were short-lived. If the problem lasted more than 6 months, then it was thought that it had to do with wartime service. In the DSM-2, published in 1968, the APA removed the diagnosis, but included adjustment reaction to adult life, which did not efficiently capture PTSD-like symptoms. This removal meant that many veterans who suffered from such symptoms couldn't receive the proper psychological help that they needed. So, we have surely come a long way in ways of treating PTSD, but we must devote more time and resources into how veterans with PTSD are treated today.